Our first inaugural 2025 roundtable on why war. And before I get started, I'm the Associate Director here, Dr. Gerald Hurwitz, and I just want to say a quick word or two about upcoming panels. The next panel, which was scheduled for February, is currently tentative. We're not sure it's going to go through, so we're going to keep you posted about that. An April roundtable on spirituality and science will be ongoing, and we're looking forward to having a really spirited roundtable.
What is it in the back that I feel?
With no further ado, let me announce our esteemed participants today. Two of our participants will be on Zoom, so the audience can see them up there on the screen, and I'm sure it's provided somehow through YouTube. The first participant, though, is not listed in our brochure because he's volunteered to be a late participant, and we're very excited to have him here, and I'll tell you who he is first. That is Mark Kissel, who received his PhD in anthropology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 2014, and was a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Notre Dame from 2014 to 2017, where he worked on a project on the evolution of human symbolic thought that intersecting with scholars from philosophy, theology, psychology, and other related disciplines. He is currently an assistant professor at the Appalachian State University in North Carolina. Mark has published on various topics in paleoanthropology, such as the morphology of early hominin mandibles, the process by which our ancestors became human, pedagogy in college, and the role of war and peace in human evolution. His first book, written with Nam Kim, Emergent Warfare in Our Evolutionary Past, was published in 2018. There's much more to read on each of these participants, so I'm going to try to keep it short. Please refer to our online or to the brochures for more details about their bios. Our other remote participant is Dai Lin, who's professor of the Department of Psychiatry and Department of Neuroscience and Physiology at New York University Grossman School of Medicine, and has studied the neural mechanisms underlying the generation of social behaviors, especially aggression and parental behaviors, for the last 20 years. Her studies investigated the neural circuits driving and modulating those behaviors, as well as the neuroplasticity in the circuits that alters the behaviors based on social experiences and reproductive states. Her works have resulted in the identification of over 10 molecularly distinct neural populations as essential for aggression, social avoidance, parental care, infanticide, sexual receptivity, and predator defense. Okay, now it's for the participants in our room here today. First, we have Charles Marmer, who is the Peter H. Shub Professor and Chair of the Department of Psychiatry at NYU Grossman School of Medicine and Langone Health. He also directs the Center for Precision Medicine and Alcohol Use Disorders and PTSD, and serves as Executive Director of the Stephen A. Cohen Military Family Center. Prior to joining NYU in 2009, Dr. Marmer was the Vice Chair of Psychiatry at UCSF and led the PTSD research program at the San Francisco VA Medical Center. Dr. Marmer earned his Bachelor of Science and MD from the University of Manitoba and completed his psychiatric residency and a fellowship in neuropharmacology at the University of Toronto. He further specialized in traumatic stress and grief at the University of California, San Francisco. An internationally recognized expert in PTSD, Dr. Marmer's advanced understanding of PTSD's biology, treatment, and prevention through studies on risk factors, biomarkers, neuroimaging, psychotherapy, and pharmacotherapy. Our director here at Helix is on the panel today, and that's Dr. Edward Nersessian, and he's clinical professor of psychiatry at Weill Cornell Medical College, training and supervising psychoanalyst at the New York Psychoanalytic Institute, distinguished life member of the American Psychiatric Association, and corresponding member of Société Psychoanalytique in Paris. He is co-founder and first co-editor of the Journal of Neuropsychoanalysis, co-editor of the Textbook of Psychoanalysis, and of Controversies in Contemporary Psychoanalysis. He has published papers on a variety of psychoanalytic subjects, and his current interest is reassessing the fundamental tenets of psychoanalytic theory. Co-founder of the Philoctetes Center and a past member of the Paris Institute, he is the founder and current director of the Helix Center for Interdisciplinary Studies. Joe Paranin has been an adjunct journalist professor at NYU since 2008 and was a full-time associate professor at Hofstra University from 2011 to 2019, where he was voted Teacher of the Year in 2017. With a 40-year career in broadcast journalism, Paranin held senior executive roles at CBS News, Fox News, and Telemundo NBC News, earning Emmy and Polk Awards for his work. In 1999, Paranin treated Telemundo as Executive Vice President of News and Information Programming. Under his leadership, the network earned an Emmy for its 9/11 coverage and critical praise for reporting on the Iraq War. Previously, Paranin served as president of Fox News from 95 to 96, where he helped establish the network's foundation and launched Fox News Sunday. At CBS News, Paranin was vice president and assistant to the president, overseeing programs like 60 Minutes and the CBS Evening News. Last but not least, Richard K. Betts is the Leo A. Schifrin Professor of War and Peace Studies Emeritus in the Columbia University Political Science Department and School of International and Public Affairs, and adjunct senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. He works on international politics and U.S. national security policy. For many years, he was director of the Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies and the International Security Policy Program at Columbia. Betts was previously a senior fellow at the Brookings Institute and taught at Harvard and Johns Hopkins NISA School of Advanced International Studies. He also served on the staff of the original U.S. Senate Intelligence Committee, which was the Church Committee, and the National Security Council, and was commissioner of the National Commission on Terrorism and member of advisory panels for the Director of Central Intelligence. He is author of 6 books: American Force, Enemies of Intelligence, Military Readiness, Nuclear Blackmail and Nuclear Balance, Surprise Attack, and Soldiers, Statesmen, and Cold War Crises. Co-author or editor of 4 other books and author of numerous articles on U.S. foreign policy, strategic intelligence, and military affairs. Okay, well, that's a lot to swallow, but anyway, wonderful. You get a sense of how wonderfully broad this group of participants is, and with that, we'll get underway.
I'll start. So the round table was suggested by Charlie, and then he wanted a round table on war. And then, of course, comes to my mind Freud's response to Einstein's question. The intellectual committee of the League of Nations wanted to put some intellectuals together dealing with the one particular question. So they asked Einstein to choose somebody with whom he would communicate on a subject, and Einstein decided to select Freud and chose the subject, why war. So he wrote to Freud and wrote a brief essay of a couple pages, and Freud responded after a couple months of thinking about it with a much longer, I think it's 10, 12 pages of an essay about why war, which may come up during the discussion. But that's the background. So why war?
Just a historical note, in reading Why War, I recommend everyone read Why War, the exchange between Einstein and Freud, for 2 reasons. It's intellectually very important and is somewhat foundational to what we'll talk about today. But more interesting, it's a direct window into each of them and their relationship and how they treat each other as the 2 eminent scientists of their time in physics and in psychology. It's very interesting. And when Freud accepts Einstein's invitation, he says in the introduction to his letter to Einstein, I will do my best to add to what you have already suggested about the problems of war. And he concludes by saying, if in the end I disappoint you in my response, I ask in advance for your forgiveness. It's not easy to respond to Albert Einstein's questions. It's an amazing and beautiful exchange to read, separate from the issues we'll talk about today.
So who wants to go ahead?
Well, given the auspices and the participants, there's an obvious proper focus on the sort of psychological, psychiatric human motivation dimensions of the question. But I think it's also interesting to think how they intersect with or depend on other levels of analysis to explain why wars happen at one time rather than another. The motivation of the individual is one source of causes. The structure or organization of governments is another. And in my business, we focus especially on a third level, and that's the anarchy of the international system. The simple fact that when there's a conflict of interest and neither side wants to concede, there's nothing to stop them from trying to resolve the question by force. So I think all of these levels can interact in different complicated ways, and untangling it's why we keep having these sorts of sessions.
Is it possible to put together something that would manage it so there would be no war? I mean, the League of Nations didn't work, NATO really doesn't work. I'm just curious, given human nature.
Well, part of the motivation for addressing this question is at least the unconscious, if not conscious, hope that there's a solution that makes war obsolete. I think most people who spend their lives studying the problem tend to be pessimistic about that possibility. But one solution, in theory, would be a stable world government. Although some would say then, if you didn't have international wars, you'd just have civil war within a world government. But while one can be pessimistic about the question, I think we have to still keep trying, if not to unrealistically figure out how to abolish war, but at least to figure out ways of combining policies to reduce the number or the intensity of the wars.
Yeah. It's a wonderful point. And to go back to the exchange between Einstein and Freud, the one thing both agreed upon was that the only definitive solution would be a world body which held responsibility for governing conflicts and to which the nations of the world would succeed authority and follow their dictates. And both said that was highly unlikely. That was when they did this in 1930.
That may work until that head body started fighting between themselves.
Right.
And then it won't hold anymore, which is why, it's not like people, there are situations where people want to actually have war, but most of the time people would prefer not to have war, but it keeps failing and we keep getting into war. And
it's also interesting to think of the historical context of their exchange in the early 1930s. A few years later, World War II broke out. World War II killed 73 million combatants and civilians. That is 3% of every person living on planet Earth died in World War II.
And that's not even counting the even greater number whose lives were ruined, even though they survived.
For generations, perhaps.
Since 1932, there have been more than 30 global wars and more than 100 million people have died since this question was first raised.
We have the four horsemen of the apocalypse. I wonder whether in each case the best bet we have is to sort of mitigate them, minimize them, right, push them back, is not going to be an end to poverty or famine completely, never, perhaps, or war. But I wonder if that is another way to look at it, incrementally, that is.
Be interesting to hear from our guests who are virtual on their perspective on, are we based on, from an anthropological perspective, and based, which is extremely interesting, and thank you, I read your papers on this, they're very instructive. And Dayu is a wonderful friend and colleague. She's a professor in my department. Freud would have loved to know Dayu Lin, because Freud would have been a postdoc in Dayu Lin's lab. Because,
For sure.
Because Dayu Lin has just developed a deep understanding of the neural substrate of the id. She owns the neurobiology of the id. So we have to ask both of them for their perspectives.
I mean, I can go first, I guess. I'd rather hear other people talk than me going on Zoom. I'm in the mountains of North Carolina, where it's been snowing for the last 16 hours. So I'm kind of stuck here right now. But yeah, I think it's so interesting, right? Because anthropologists sort of approach this question very, very differently. We want to know about the evolutionary, origins of warfare. When did it begin? How did it begin? Why did it begin? And our debates, sort of, I haven't read it in a while, but the Einstein-Freud thing, it's sort of similar to what we debate now. It's like, my colleagues get up in arms about, well, what's the first evidence of warfare? When do we begin, become interpersonal violence, become more sort of collective? At the same time, there were anthropologists in the 50s arguing about this too, who were like, oh, we're innately violent, or we're innately warlike, or we're innately peaceful. Whereas sort of my take is we're innately human, and there's various ways we're going to respond to this kind of stuff, right? I mean, I'm not a psychologist, but my assumption being that for a long time, we didn't have the capacity to be violent, but also the capacity to be peaceful. And then we sort of have to tease that stuff apart. So a lot of the anthropological thinking here has become, well, is war something that happens only once we have state-level societies, right? Is it a response to living in large groups? Or is it that living in large groups actually decreases war because the state prevents violence? I think if you come up with an answer for that, I wouldn't be at Appalachian State University, I'd be at Harvard or Yale. But I do think that that's sort of that's kind of what I've been thinking about, is how do we manage this? And also, why is it, and to allude to y'all's questions, why is it that people today especially have a very pessimistic view of human behavior? Why is it that we think we're always going to be violent?
Great. Should I jump in here? Oh.
Yes, please, Dayu.
All right. Okay. Yeah. So first of all, thanks for the opportunity. And I have to say, I don't think about the war that much. I usually think about it from a very small creature, which is mice. That's the subject we study, and that's what we, do all our experiments on. So generally, my lab has a very strong focus on aggression, which I think probably a lot of people can see the link between aggression, violence, and war, ultimately. But it's very interesting whenever I talk to people outside of neuroscience. So because when I say aggression, typically I consider it as a social behaviors. As I study social behavior, including aggression. So aggression is a part of actually the natural behavior repertoire of the animals. And it is involving social interaction. So I generally consider it a part of the social behavior rather than an anti-social behavior. So which is generally in a human society, any of the aggression is bad. But for mice, for rodents, aggression, we consider it as an innate behavior. By innate, it is actually a very largely hardwired behavior, I have to say. By that, I mean that the neural circuits that controlling this behavior is very much developmentally wired. So there are already structures all in the brains that was just ready to go to drive those behaviors. So we can demonstrate that by showing that in naive animals that has never had any experience of aggression, but if we activating certain parts of the brain, especially in the hypothalamus, then we can induce those behaviors. So towards proper targets or improper targets, mice generally, especially male mice, they only attack male intruders. They don't attack female. That's called the resident intruder assay. And to talk about that, actually, another interesting thing about human, you may think human highly aggressive. I actually think human very peaceful beings. So we are in this room and discussing. Mice, they wouldn't do that. So you have a mouse and in a cage, and you put another male mouse in, they will fight. They will fight to the death, actually. So in that sense, humans are, in fact, I consider it evolutionized to be not very aggressive. So then, yes, so as I said, in the mouse, they are those circuits, especially in the hypothalamus, and then into the midbrains, a lot of effort to trying to understand where those circuits are located. And those circuits, they are just developmentally, with the molecular programming and transcription factors, that they are planned, they have been planned to be there and they're ready to go. And that's very critical.
What triggers them?
What triggers them? That's a very good question. So what triggers them, for example, the region we study in the hypothalamus, and the main trigger for those cells to activate those cells are actually male cues, another conspecific male cues. We can show that those cells, even when they're not involved in aggression, but when you have another male intruder comes in, the specific cues about that male can drive those cells to become activated. And then there is a lot of flexibility in those cells. I said, well, they are hardwired, but in fact, not all animals, they show aggression in the identical ways. Some animals are very ready to attack. Other animals, they will never attack. And there are actually a lot of the difference we can trace back to the properties of those cells. And those cells, the properties and how they wire together, how efficient the circuit is to go from sensing this cue to drive the motor output, largely depending on how efficient this circuit is. And the efficiency of this circuit actually can change with the animal's experience. Our recent study showed that if the animal wins the fight, there is this plasticity happening, and it potentiated the connections among the circuit. It also increased how easily the cell can get excited. And with the repeated winning, the cells get super excitable. So very easily you trigger it, very minor input, then the cell will fire. And when they fire, the consequence of it is the animal will exhibit aggressive behaviors, that they will attack. So as the animal, we found that as the animal wins a lot, they were initially, very selective in what kind of a target they will attack. But as they become super winners, then they will actually have this very generalized aggression. They think they're the king. They can take on any target, even animals that's much bigger than they are. They clearly don't have a physical advantage. So there is a lot in those circuits we study. But one thing I do want to say, in our resident intruder assays, which is our showbox cage that we just put in another mouse, but in some circumstances, we're trying to understand, how the environment might be changing the aggression levels. In some experiments, and also in the literatures, they are experiments that were trying to put animals, like 10 animals, into a big, larger arenas and understand how the aggression goes. So there are two things about aggression, which I kind of feel like is somewhat relatable to human behaviors. One is the resource, okay? Depends on the size of the arena. When the size is smaller, then the animals wouldn't be able to establish a territory. So they kind of have to live together and establish a hierarchy and share the resource. And aggression generally is very high at the beginning, when they are trying to figure out who is the stronger animals. And once the hierarchy is established, then the aggression level becomes much lower. and then that's where things get stable. When there is disturbance in this hierarchy structures, when the alpha got moved away, then you will see all the animals start to fight for that alpha position again. So the aggression level will transiently goes up until the structure was being reestablished. So that's kind of like instability in the society can increase aggression. And the other is the size of the arena. When the arena is small, they have to establish a hierarchy. But when the arena becomes really big, then everybody carve out a little area to become their territory. And then the aggression also really reduced unless, others invade your territory, and then there will be fights. Otherwise, individuals just can live peacefully on having their own little space. So that's kind of like, in a way, I can think of human behaviors a bit in terms of if there's a lot of space, there's not a lot of competition, a lot of resource, then generally the need to compete for resources is lower, and the need for fighting probably war also is less. So that's kind of my little thoughts from my study on the little mice. But I have to say that all these circuits we study in the hypothalamus is conserved across the mammalian species, in fact across the vertebrate species. They're existing in reptiles, in fish. They existing in mice, in primates, cats, dog, human, all of us. So there's no reason to think we don't have those structures. So we absolutely do. Yep.
Several of these interesting points, I think, relate to a flip side of the question we're talking about. And I think one might as well ask, why not war? In the sense that if you think of the overwhelming history of human evolution, I don't think people would find anything surprising about the prevalence of violence. But war is a very highly organized collective activity, which I'm not a scientist in this area, but probably you don't see in very many species of the animal kingdom, as distinct from more individualized aggression. But in civilization, as it were, of the last several thousand years, some mechanisms have developed that, for one reason or another, have limited that kind of pervasive survival of the fittest Darwinian pattern of life. So matching the logic of evolution on the action of the human motivation and other factors, and how that's changed with mechanisms for restraining war, I think is, in some ways, the heart of the question.
In your experience, there are some wars that are considered that were, let's say, necessary. And then there are wars that after the fact you say, that war should not have happened, or should not have, we should know, if it's the person, the country that is admitting they shouldn't have done the war, so we shouldn't have gone there. What makes for the difference, and why? I mean, I've read not so long ago, for example, that the Iraq war was not necessary. So what then motivated the war if it wasn't necessary?
Well, I think almost anybody who starts a war thinks it's necessary. Maybe necessary for reasons we would consider wrong reasons or stupid reasons or immoral reasons, but for whatever reasons they thought it was necessary. And in most cases, whoever loses a war probably thinks it was unnecessary for obvious reasons. Well, in the latter case, I mean, one thing we often don't think about, but has a certain perverse logic to it, is that, as Clausewitz said, it's the defender who starts the war. For example, why do we say that World War II in Europe began in September 1939? Because Germany invaded Poland.
Right.
But why do we never say that it began in March 1939 when Germany invaded Czechoslovakia? Because in September, the Poles fought. In March, the Czechs did not. There's always, almost always a way to avoid war, and that's for one party to give the other what it demands. And in a conflict of interest, you either get both sides, or one side realizing it can't win, or both sides realizing they have more to gain from a compromise, or they can't agree, and the only way to resolve it is by force. But then one of them has to be miscalculating. One of them has to think they're better off going to war than giving up. And if they lose, then they miscalculated. So they thought it was necessary, but it turned out it wasn't.
You're talking about Iraq II, right? The Second Iraq War, in which the reasons were given were not accurate. I mean, the government misled, I think, the public on what the situation was. But the public was supportive, went in and found out Saddam Hussein did not have anything to do with 9/11. But the goal of the U.S. government was to get rid of Saddam Hussein. So it was mischaracterized as linked to 9/11. Was it necessary? I don't think so, but it was built up, and that actually hurt the credibility of Bush's standing in the world, because his government, his people misled everybody to think this was the source of terrorism when it wasn't. So that's where it gets off the mark, and information is managed, of course, and information is given to the public that supports the government.
Who's gaining in that?
Well, the government was putting out a position that the U.S. government was putting out a position that he was involved. And they were pushing that forward through Congress. And they even got Colin Powell to go make speeches before the United Nations based on inaccurate information. So that's really what, information's a major factor in driving, of course, war, how things are positioned.
Including the Bush administration's position that Iraq was harboring weapons of mass destruction.
Right.
Which was not the case.
Did they believe it, and that's what made them anxious, and they went into war?
Yeah, I think they had several motives. The one they used mainly to justify it in public was the mistaken judgment about weapons of mass destruction, for which there was what seemed before the fact overwhelming circumstantial evidence. Turned out to be wrong. But I think basically Bush, with the hubris of the post-Cold War era, thought he could do a good deed at low cost, that he'd overthrow this monster, Saddam Hussein, remake and democratize the Middle East, and it wouldn't cost very much. It'd be like the first Gulf War. We'd be greeted as liberators. Well,
Exactly.
miscalculated.
That's right.
Can I just jump in real quick?
Yes,
I think
please.
it was Richard who pointed out, like, what do we know about war and other animals? Just to do my due diligence as the anthropologist in the room, right? This is a huge problem we have because, animal behaviorists will say, oh, ants do war or spiders do war because they're using it as an analogy, right, what they see. But I think for the evolutionary anthropology question, it comes like, is that really war? I mean, very famously, chimpanzees will occasionally go on what we call raiding parties. And if you can go on YouTube and watch them, they get together, they don't, how they communicate, we don't know, and they go out and they spot other chimps that are not in their group, and they will kill them. And people have argued, why that happens, right? Is it because they're hungry and chimps will hunt colobus monkeys as well, but sometimes it seems like they're just killing them, because they want them gone. And folks have argued, well, maybe they're trying to make it seems like the chimpanzees will only go on these raiding parties when they know that the enemy chimps nearby they can outnumber them. There's more of them than there are of the other group. So they maybe make some calculations. But again, I think the question you all are getting at is that war? I don't know. We don't know why chimps do it. And the sort of super secret we have for primatology is that the chimps have been pushed into small regions where humans don't live right now. So going back to Dayu's question about how resource allocation works here, right? That's also the problem is what we know about animal behavior is affected by humans watching them. So I think it's a really interesting question that we just don't know. The origins of war are so kind of murky because the archaeological record is so incomplete, if that makes sense.
So very interesting points from the primates. I wanted to respond to something Dayu said, which was that in larger groups, rodents will be aggressive. They have a neurocircuitry of aggression. It's easily triggered. We share fundamentally the same conserved neural pathways that rodents have in aggression. So while rodents don't sit around and have round tables, our quote-unquote primitive brains, or at least the machinery, the deeper brain structures which serve sexuality, attachment, parenting, and aggression are virtually identical in humans as in rodents. So that's something we have to take very seriously, that we are rodents with a high-powered prefrontal cortex. That's who we are. Next question is, you mentioned that aggression will be unleashed until there's a point in a group of rodents in which a stable hierarchy of control and dominance is established. That is a very interesting observation. One of the things that Freud talked about in Why War was the period called Pax Romana. You'll recall that there was a period of approximately 230 years from the turn of the millennium till about 200 AD with the death of Emperor Marcus Aurelius, in which there was 200 years of peace in the Roman Empire. It was a time of great cultural flourishing, of construction, of road building, of poetry, of advancement of medical science, astronomy, everything else, and almost no war and conflicts. And the pathway to that period of Pax Romana was through relentless Roman aggression until they completely dominated the entire Roman Empire. So that ironically, the pathway to peace was not through the establishment of a collective governing agency. It was through pure hierarchical dominance. That is to say, the pathway to peace was through war.
But that's a governing agency.
Right.
Maybe for bad reasons or not. Why has there not been a war between the United States and Mexico since the 1840s when we did have a war? I suspect it's not because the Mexicans think it was quite right for them to lose almost half their country to the United States. I imagine part of it's the Mexicans realize there's nothing we can do about it.
Correct.
So why fight?
Yeah, so maybe I just jump in a little bit also about, just the nature of aggression. As I said, it is social behaviors. I'm not implying it will be the same feature will be extrapolated to the war, but in fact, ultimately, as a part of the behaviors that the animal is encouraged to express in a sense, because that is a way for them to secure resource, defending territories, and secure the mating opportunities. So one thing we realize is that actually winning a fight is very rewarding to the animals intrinsically. So the animals that they are willing to voluntarily seek the opportunity to express such behaviors. If they're allowed to, without anything else. And when we record from their dopamine signals in the nuclear accumbens, which is the region that's famous for addictions because of all the reinforcement being called the pleasure chemicals. But its a function is much more complicated than that. But generally in that area, what we found is that a positive experience will increase the dopamine release, such as food and sexual behaviors, and a negative experience, such as a food shock, will decrease the dopamine release. And guess what? When the animal win a fight, the dopamine nicely increased in their areas. So, and that's sufficient to reinforce that behaviors as well as the context the animals is within. So there is this behavior paradigm in which you can show that when the animal is winning a fight in a particular area, then they establish a preference for the areas, suggesting that this is actually a rewarding experience to the animal. So, of course, when the animal loses a fight, then it's not rewarding at all. So when the animal got defeated, then we found that this dopamine chemical is reduced. So, and the animal learn from those experiences. Once the animal lose a fight, they will actually learn that this is an opponent, that's a superior opponent, and I should avoid it. So next time when the animal is encounter this opponent again, instead of their natural tendency to approach the opponent, they will quickly avoid that opponent. And there is neuroplasticity in the brain, so we now have some understanding of what has happened to cause the animals to go from this approach behaviors, engage in the fight versus avoiding this aggressor. So there is this balance, even though in a way this can help you secure resource, but when the chance of losing the fight is very high, the animal learn to avoid it. So that's kind of also in a situation, basically a fight is costly and is risky, and the animal needs to do risk assessment to determine whether this is a worthwhile fight. And in situations, we can manipulate a certain part of the brain, which learned that the animal, once they lose the fight, those brain activities will actually increase when they encounter the aggressor again. So to tell the animal, but if we reduce activity in those brain areas, then the animal do not have that information, which will result them to continue to engage in the fight. And what happen? What happen is they will actually be defeated more. So basically, when you engage in a fight that's disadvantaged in the animal world, which is probably not surprising, then they will incur more severe consequence than if they just stay away from that conflict. There is a lot of, again, I can see kind of a lot of talking about why Mexico was not trying to fight the United States. But if it's a fight you're going to lose, at least for the little mouse, they know that it's better to stay away instead of trying to continue to fight. There are situations that might as well continue to fight, even though it is not a fair fight. That is something we call the maternal aggression. So when the moms then they become moms, they will actually protecting the youngs, and they will take on much bigger target that they will normally not fight, and they will not really have, a good chance of winning. But when you have a precious goods, when you have a very strong motivation, then moms will do it, will fight. And when they fight really viciously and willfully and under certain conditions, they will be able to drive away the intruders.
In the basic way, is it more than just the fight-flight response in its fundamental way? What you observe?
They are, so flight and fight, it captures the two reactions of the animal to another opponent. So, but the classic flight and the fight, they're actually probably not all talking about the conspecific. The flight is more against a predator when you have a real, much bigger threat. That was not something within your ability of a fight against. So then that will be the flight. And in fact, in that context, probably it's all about predator. When the predator is imminent, then they will actually fight rather than flight. But if they could, they will try to flight.
Because in humans, you can see a lot of, now I'm not talking about war, I'm just talking about regular fighting, that most of the time behind it is some degree of anxiety that triggers the aggressive response, and then you have a fight.
Yes.
And so yes. I'm wondering to what degree triggering of fear is foundational to a lot of expression of aggression. Now, war is much more complicated because obviously there are a lot more motives for it. but not in expression of aggression can be triggered or is triggered with something, with that basic self-protective instinct.
Yeah, very good question. So what I can tell you is that in a fight that the aggressor is one of the animals is clearly a dominant animal. So in the case that when we do our experiment, if the animal's body weight is differ by 20%, usually the bigger, the heavier animals has a much bigger advantage over the smaller animals. So under those conditions, the big animals is, if guaranteed to win, then the stress pathway was not activated. So they do not need to be stressed in order to fight. So the animals, as I mentioned, that the dopamine is released, the fight itself experience winning is a sufficiently rewarding experience for the animal to express that behaviors without the need to defend or feeling anxious. But in the case with the female, it's a different situations. So in that case, part of the defense is, there is a whole circuit changes. The aggression circuit was being highly boosted during the maternal period in order for the animals to be able to express it. So usually the anxiety, in fact, we are right now looking at the relationship between anxiety and aggression. So I think it's a kind of a U-shaped relationship, which means that under normal conditions, actually, we think that the more anxious animals tend to be less aggressive, at least in our hands, under normal conditions. The anxiety is something that actually decreases aggression. But under conditions that's highly anxiogenic, then it can, again, start to boost aggression. So there is this sort of not a simple linear relationship between these two things.
Did I understand you to mean that sometimes aggression is expressed just for the fun of it?
In mice, yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, and important to say, in our careful psychological studies of warfighters, including I did a lifetime study of a representative sample of every man and every woman who fought in the Vietnam War and followed them for 50 years to look at the adverse consequences and the adaptive consequences. Among the intense warfighters, those in battles in which they dominated expressed high levels of sexual excitement in the context of killing.
But my theory about that has been that the sexual excitement is used to counter the
Fear.
the fear. And so
Perhaps.
sex becomes a kind of a calming drug for fighting fear.
I think it can serve multiple purposes, but I wouldn't underestimate the excitement separate from the fear. And this has been known in tribal warfare, in small group warfare, in the preparation for war, where the group is reasonably confident that they're dominant. There's a high level of excitement and interest in conquest and killing. And that's not necessarily defensive against fear. It is, unfortunately, the pleasure of killing.
I was just going to mention that, I think in extrapolating from animal studies to humans, one of the things that is really importantly different is that humans have a much more, the stimuli that can cause aggression is more abstract, can be more abstract. Charles, you were mentioning having a larger prefrontal cortex, so the sorts of stimuli that we count as being a potential cause for aggression is much greater. And you have to know that what weapons of mass destruction mean. I mean, you can't tell the mice, you better watch out, they've got an atomic bomb. But we know what that means. And we don't have to see the same mouse over and over again to know I don't want to fight him. I might see someone similar to that mouse in size or whatever, in some other aspect. So I think that the increase in abstraction in what can count as a cause for fighting. Oh, by the way, also to including justice. We haven't talked about that also. I mean, we might think of mice mothers protecting the young as an act of enacting justice in some way, supporting someone who's weaker than they are. So we also expand those sorts of categories. I think that's an important distinction, and maybe accounts for some of the ambiguities that occur in human aggression that don't occur among mice.
So one thing that Dayu is saying is that the more successful the animal is in dominant aggressive behavior, the more rewarding that experience is, the more rewarding it is through dopamine, endorphins, and other pleasure chemicals, the more likely they are to further engage. In human warfare, humans, at least my Vietnam veterans, told me they engaged in killing for 3 primary reasons. The first reason was they believed it was their patriotic responsibility to defend their country. So they engaged, they believed, those, especially the Vietnam veterans who volunteered for the war as opposed to being drafted, actually many of them believed they were doing the right thing to serve their country. Second reason is, in the situation, there is a high level of excitement as well as fear in the battle situation. And then third, because we investigated the My Lai massacre and other atrocities, and what we found is that it's normal, not abnormal, for war fighters in very difficult battle situations where they take losses to engage in atrocities. That is not they are not psychopaths going to war. These were not bad people who had lives of unempathic, aggressive behavior necessarily in their development. They were people of normal war, witnessed the brutal death of their comrades in war, and became so enraged and so vengeful that they went and killed anyone in their sight, women, children, civilians, everybody, in killing sprees. So killing in war occurs for altruistic reasons of serving one's country, for the excitement and pleasure of killing, and especially for revenge killing among humans. I don't know if you see the analogs of those in animal models, but where the prefrontal cortex gets in with the limbic system, that's what you get.
This interacts with other physical problems too, sleep deprivation, prolonged high stress of prolonged combat, and all of these things feed into the revenge acts that go with atrocities.
And drugs.
Yeah. And levels of training too. Highly trained troops are a little bit less prone to it than poorly trained ones. There's a lot of variables that enter in that I think facilitate the phenomena you're talking about.
I totally agree with you, but the most shocking finding from that study, of which there were many, what we went into the study thinking that the commission of atrocities would be a horrible but rare event in war. 1/3 of the participants that we surveyed, and we surveyed them for 5, 6, 7 hours on several occasions, so we really got to have very honest and deep conversations with them. 1/3 of Vietnam veterans who served in the war zone, 3 million American men and women, admitted to committing or witnessing an atrocity.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
this,
one
by the
thing-
way, I think is one among many reasons that policymakers can more blithely decide to go to war when they don't experience the concatenation of problems you've mentioned that make what they think of as unnatural and atypical really typical.
They delegate their wars to other people. They live back in capitals.
Right.
And now with the,
And they hardly ever send their own kids to
Exactly.
fight them, too.
and now with AI and all that, they can be at a distance, and most of Americans won't necessarily feel the impact. One of the things about the Iraq War and Afghanistan is most of the citizens had no idea what the consequences were, let alone for the soldiers, for the country. I mean, they really didn't feel it. They just went on with their normal lives.
Yeah, so one thing I may add, because Charlie's mentioned the aggression and the sexual arousal aspects of it. So I just want to add a little bit from a neurobiological point. The aggression and the sexual behavior circuits are very intertwined in the brain. So it's probably not by accident, because of these are both engaging conspecifics of a different sex, but there's a lot of shared features of male and females. So when the brain processes informations, so there is a lot of shared pathways to process those informations. And many of the brain regions, they contain cells that actually are activated by some cells in the same regions are involved in aggressive behavior, some cells are involved in sexual behaviors, and some cells are actually involved in both. And a lot of they express the hormone receptors, the sex hormone receptors. So, which actually making there is a lot of a crosstalk between these two circuits. In fact, one of the most effective way to trying to increase aggression in the laboratory mice is to give them a sexual experience. That actually helps to increase the aggression level of the male mice. And usually the male mice that's very good and aggressive, they tend to also be very good to engage in sexual behaviors. So there is definitely a lot of a crosstalk at the biological levels between these two behaviors. And the other phenomena in aggression, again, in the case with mice, is that there is this called a priming effect, which is that if you have engaged in an aggressive event, then the brain circuit, the circuit is at this elevated state. And when there is another target in sight, the animals is much faster in engaging the aggressive interaction again, because of the aggression circuit has been primed. So this is a very well known phenomena. So it's just, kind of partly related to some of the phenomena that Charlie has just mentioned.
I think that's really interesting to hear that. I was just thinking from an anthropological perspective again. I don't know how much this gets cited outside of anthropology, but in the 1980s, there was this huge study done about the Yanomamo. Yanomamo are people in Brazil, like we live in the rainforest. And what happened is an anthropologist argued that amongst the Yanomamo, the men who killed somebody else, who had committed murder and warfare, they had a higher fitness, they had more kids. And this was taken to suggest that, well, war exists because, well, if you kill someone else, you will have more kids. And it gets cited a lot. The problem with this that came out later is, yes, it seems like sort of the men who killed had more kids, but also you have more kids as you get older. And as you get older, you're more likely to have engaged in war. It seems to be a place where there's a lot of violence. It's more likely to have killed just because you're getting older. And also the headsmen of this group are more likely to have kids just because of their position in authority, and the headsmen are more likely to have killed. So I think it's just sort of interesting to sort of tease apart these differences. Like you point out how hard it is to do with mice. With humans, you can't do these kind of natural studies. So we have this issue of well, what does it mean to be? What I guess what I'm trying to say is that for the majority of humans' existence, we were living in small-scale societies, right? We're not living in sort of these large state-level societies. And then thinking about, why does war exist? I think partly we have to think about the fact that the way we live now is only in the last couple thousand years. Farming is only 10,000 years old. For the rest of the millions of years that humans were on the planet, or our ancestors, we were living in these sort of very different societies. So it's really hard to know, what our natural tendencies are.
Yeah, actually, that reminds me of few studies on the mice again. So, which is that they basically, it was a long time ago, it was this book called Mice All Over. So, in the book, they were trying to do an experiment, which is basically have a barn and they put a lot of male, female mice into this barn and see how the mice will just naturally distribute. So it turned out that there are three groups of mice at the end. So there's one group of mice, the males able to secure their territory. So they give like little huts. So the males able to have their own hut, and usually they will be able to have one or two females to live with them. And then they will patrolling their areas and be very effective in getting rid of other mice trying to invade. And those mice are the most successful reproductively. So their offsprings tend to be able to, prevail. And then the second group of mice, they are the males and the females. They will tend to live together. And those males still have access to the females, but the offspring tend to not survive very well because in this crowded sort of communal living conditions. And then there's a third group of males which actually they just live by themselves. They try to skirt out during the daytime or when everybody is sleeping. They're at the bottom of the society and they have no access to the females. So they will never have offsprings. So that's kind of, in a way, is a natural selection. The animals with more ability to defend their territory, which typically means higher aggression levels or higher fighting ability, I would say. It's actually in the ecological, there's a term called resource holding potentials. So when they have higher resource holding potentials, then they will be able to reproduce more effectively, which in a way is, how select that kind of a trait evolutionary for that species. So usually, in fact, the aggression from the evolutionary point, it was a ecological point, it was considered a part of the reproductive behaviors. They are kind of together because the main purpose of it is actually to trying to reproduce, to securing the mate, securing the resources, securing the territory. All of that is needed to protect the pup at the end of the day. Yeah.
Wow. Incredible.
Well, the idea that male mice get, let's say, a reward via dopamine is one level in which they're rewarded, but then also if they get that more mating going on, that's like another level. Right? And I'm interested in the comment Mark made about the people where the men also had that same sort of thing. They were rewarded, they were considered leaders, and had more mating opportunities. In our culture, we have this sort of myth of the hero, going back to Homer, where the warriors were venerated because of their prowess. And that's another level, again, like a more abstract level of reward that our warriors used to garner. And we know it's often commented even with Vietnam, that the idea of these people being wonderful heroes started to get eroded somewhat, and now it's sort of almost turned in the opposite direction. What effect has that had on the way wars go on and how warriors return?
Incredible. Yeah. It's very difficult to, first of all, that was a very elegant experiment you just described, Dayu, very interesting, very profound, actually. The translation of that to human society is complex, but for sure there's echoes of it in the way you're describing. I had a funny experience after Ed suggested we do this. Then when I was thinking about, Martin Luther King's comment that the arc of history bends slowly, but it bends towards justice. Very beautiful, deep statement. We hope it's true. We don't know precisely if it's true. One of the questions for us as a group is, does the arc of history, or what we call civilization, bend towards the diminishment or the increase of war over time? I'm not sure. It's a very complicated problem, but I have one of my wonderful grandchildren, Noah, is an excellent athlete, but he's 13 years old. He's an early adolescent boy, very aggressive, very excellent baseball player, and very into his Bay Area sports. And I was asking him about something about the NFL playoffs this year, and he said, "Don't mention the Kansas City Chiefs to me. I hate the Kansas City Chiefs." Now, I've never heard him actually say that he hated anything before. He's a kind and generally very loving boy. But he actually literally hates the Kansas City Chiefs because they took the 49ers out of one of the playoffs, and he bears a vengeful grudge about this. The question is, what is that behavior? Is that just tribalism? Is sports the new Roman form? Is this tribalism? And the deeper question is, as we move up, if we are, through levels from less developed, more primitive ways of organizing civilization, hopefully towards more humane, collaborative, and empathic ways of organizing civilization, do we ever leave the earlier levels? Are they deeply embedded in our biology, psychology, and culture? And if so, is civilization like a Russian stacking doll? That is to say, inside it are all of the earlier developmental phases, which included tribalism, hunting other tribes, killing them, and then engaging in cannibalism to assert the domination of the tribe. That's part of our history. But is it part of our presence in the sense that as we move from one level of cultural or psychological development to a higher level, that we bring all the others with us? There's lots of reasons to believe from psychoanalysis and from ego psychology to believe that for every developmental level that we go through as humans, psychosexual development, personality development, that we bring all the others with us, and that they, under specific circumstances, can all be reactivated. So the question is the civilization we've built, is it a stable, strong, and thick and durable structure, or is civilization a thinly layered human construction that can be easily blown up under the right circumstances, and we quickly regress to much more primitive forms of behavior? Certainly in warfare, it's the latter, because people of normal social development will engage in very primitive, aggressive, and sexual behaviors that they would never otherwise do. So it's just a question, how durable is the civilization we're building, or is the deep brain, the mesolimbic brain, sitting in there as a thermonuclear potential, always ready to blow up our beautiful structures?
Well, there's a lot of literature debating this question. And sort of oversimplify it, two ends, you have the pessimists who say, really, history's a cycle, and we have ups and downs, but yeah, we always eventually come back to the bad stuff. And others who say, no, there's sort of a teleological process where society liberalizes, matures, recognizes better ways of doing things. And yes, there are ups and downs, but the trend is up. And there's controversy about how to measure the incidence and intensity of war to try to answer the question. And I don't think there's any consensus yet, but the basic problem, it seems to me, that you could try to find institutional solutions to where possible, but the basic problem is what to do about conflicts of interest when neither side is willing to concede in a system, either an international system, which is anarchy in this, just in the sense there's no world government, or a national system where the government is very weak or divided. I think most people until fairly recently thought the United States was sort of a a beacon on the hill of a stable, functioning society that had bad problems for a while, but we had a civil war and got rid of slavery, and then bad problems for a while, and we had civil rights legislation, and things were steadily getting better. And I think in the last few years, people have had their doubts that it's not regressing, that another civil war isn't beyond imagination.
Is it because the people who are, some people anyway, are trying to divide and bring out the worst about the other one, demonize other people?
That's
and
polarization.
That's how to get ahead. Polarization is...
Yeah. Polarization means neither side can see a compromise that can work. And without compromise, it's hard to see how a democracy functions.
But it's we, them, and those guys are demons, they're evil, they're terrible.
Well, maybe that grows on the debate, but a lot of it is just a conflict of interest over beliefs and material interests.
But some people aren't getting all the information. They're only getting side
information.
information.
That's a growing problem. We don't all watch Walter Cronkite at the same time
Well,
anymore.
thank you very much.
Well, in your impression, are we having less wars than 500 years ago? In other words, it seems to me, but maybe that was very kind of a small sample. When I was a student and we were studying
500 years
history,
ago?
yeah, 500 years ago, we were studying history.
I was there with you.
That history was mostly about wars.
Well, who knows what our history is going to look like to people 500 years later. There's a lot of controversy about how to answer the question empirically. I think certainly in the Western world, the answer looks like, yes, a lot less war than before. You go back 500 years and Europe was the bloodiest region of the world. But the Western world is only a fairly small part of the world. And most of the wars going on these days you don't hear about. They're on page 17 of the New York Times. Right. There are a lot of them, but CNN doesn't go to Sudan very often.
Yeah. I mean, this was the point of one of Steven Pinker's new books, right? Was that war, Better Angels of Our Nature.
Better Angels of Our Nature.
Yeah, he's like, well, look, there's the state has mitigated this, and the Enlightenment makes it that we're living in the most peaceable era now. And I'll say, I don't really think you could know that, right? Certainly, maybe, in his book, he doesn't really get to other kinds of violence, right? He's just looking at like interpersonal violence. But violence in general has probably increased, or at least it's a different way. And like you point out, I think Joe's point is really salient too, is that like people want to use the data that psychiatrists, anthropologists that we create to drive their own narrative, right? So they want to say, yes, I'm just thinking, I read a lot of sort of the popular science books about this topic, and they'll say like, oh, well, we know humans are innately violent, so we shouldn't be surprised that this happens. But I'm not sure we do know that.
So one thing I want to say about, the point of whether, a little bit about how innately violent we are and whether we are built on the civilization with a thin layer in the core that was pretty hardwired to execute certain behaviors. I think one thing which is very fundamentally different between the animal and the human is that for animals, if they engage in a fight and they win the fight, there is no consequence. There is no punishment. For human societies, I think that's a very different stories. And I didn't do that experiment, but I assure you, I imagine if I did do that experiment, if for every single fight the animal initiate, the animal will receive a full shock, a punishment, then my guess is very quickly the animal will stop fighting. So there is a consequence, but for the mice, they win. That's how they secure resource, and generally there is a positive outcome associated with it, so it's being reinforced. But for humans, it's very different because when we, under normal societies, when we engaging aggressive actions as a mean to secure resource, then there is going to be bad consequence. So that, I think, will deter in the normal conditions, this kind of negative reinforcement learnings. But in the war conditions, I can imagine this is a situation that this punishment is being lifted. It's just, my naive thinking of those situations to see why there is this suddenly kind of emergence of this bad human natures. Yeah. So, but I do want to say that the human aggression and animal aggression are very different. And I say we study aggression, I never say I study anger, because I don't know what is the emotional state of the animal, whether they're angry at all or not. And the thing that trigger aggression in rodents and in many species are very clear. So what the cells are, hardwired to respond to. But for humans, the thing that make us angry or trigger our aggression could be so different, so diverse. And the way we express aggression is also very diverse. It could be all verbal, right? So that, that layers of difference, which is very difficult to study in non-human species. But that really fundamentally, I think, even though we do have those in the course, but I think that there is a lot of elaboration and other systems that change our behaviors, control our behavior, moderate our behaviors.
It's true, but I think that's definitely true when we think about angry confrontations between individuals, groups, perhaps even nations. But with regard to your question, I was thinking, is the situation any different from the Roman Empire? I don't think so. I don't think as a civilization, as a society, that we've evolved beyond. The Romans had a clear idea, and it was world domination of the world as they knew it, and they were able to successfully do that, and they secured peace because, for the reason you mentioned, which is their opponents were very reluctant to take them on. It was too dangerous. Better to go along than to confront and die. Now, World War II was staked out on that same principle. It was an open competition, at least on the part of the Third Reich, to achieve world domination, and would have done so if they could have done so militarily. And if you think about the conflicts now between America, the Western world, Russia, China, whatever, the great powers, they would maneuver probably for world domination, but they're constrained by nuclear threat. I don't think they're constrained by civilization or empathy or deeper understanding. They're constrained by mutually assured destruction. The deepest fear in international relations is mutually assured destruction in nuclear conflict. It has been the only thing, I think, that has prevented, for example, a nuclear confrontation between the West and Russia during the height of the Cold War. That Russia was a rational state, is a rational state actor to that extent, and would not engage in an exchange of nuclear weapons, and backed down during the time of the Cuban crisis for that reason, although they didn't want to. The threat was too great. So it seems to me the only thing that has actually constrained world war in our time is the existence of nuclear weapons, which guarantee mutually assured destruction. So in that respect, I don't think the psychology or the level of maturity of the civilization of our world is any different from the world during Roman times. Zero.
Okay.
I just want to raise one other question. Maybe we can touch on before we open it up for for the audience to ask questions. So, following up on your comment, Charles, and then I think interesting comment that you made earlier about the ways in which she doesn't consider, and correct me if I'm wrong in paraphrasing, does not consider aggression in mice anyway as being antisocial or necessarily antisocial. It could be eusocial when it functions in a sort of proper way. Here we've heard examples of how different sovereignties have, perhaps through gaining a monopoly on violence, the Roman Empire, for example, that they've created a Pax Romana on account of that sort of monopoly of violence. You know, we say, well, the international body would have a difficult time attaining that sort of monopoly on violence, and there would be internecine wars and civil wars and such. I'm wondering, beyond the idea, and I think the somewhat novel idea for me, that aggression can actually stop aggression. It's sort of, it seems a bit euphemistic, but maybe it happens, or utopian. But what other processes we haven't maybe touched on so far might be pro-peace, like other than insisting on violence, maintaining order through violence, with a threat of it?
Well, just before we go into that very difficult question, since we started with Einstein and Freud, Einstein famously said that you cannot prepare for war and peace at the same time. Ronald Reagan said that that was wrong, and actually demonstrated that it was wrong, that Einstein was incorrect about that, because he actually managed the threat of the Soviet Union by simultaneously preparing for war and peace, and his strategy was to outspend the Soviet Union. He understood that they could not compete with America on guns and butter at the same time, and he competed with them to the point where he drove the Soviet Union into near bankruptcy and capitulation by a massive arms buildup and a massive domestic buildup of industry, guns and butter at the same time, preparing for war and peace simultaneously, and the Russians could not compete. They could compete on weapons at the expense of a starving population, so they capitulated. So Ronald Reagan actually disproved what Einstein thought about that. Just a historical footnote. I don't know if you agree with that.
Well, Einstein also famously wrote a letter to Franklin Roosevelt before American entry into World War II, calling Roosevelt's attention to the need for an atomic bomb program. And I don't know if it's apocryphal or not, but I always remember the quotation attributed to Einstein when asked about why people couldn't work out peace better. He said, because politics is harder than physics. A lot of the problem, at least in the discipline I come from, is the balance of power and estimating it. Because in an anarchic international system, nobody can enforce the law except the parties themselves. And if there's a gross imbalance of power, then the weaker, if they're sensible, concede to the stronger. Well, for a little hiatus after about 1989, in the Cold War, we had about a dozen years of American primacy, where we thought of the Cold War as bipolar, with two roughly equal powers contending with each other, and the Soviets collapsed. In part, I would say, because Gorbachev had naive faith in the liberal vision of various peaceful ways of enforcing global cooperation. So he essentially surrendered. Reagan just collected his concessions and pocketed them. And I think that's part of the reason that Gorbachev is so widely hated in Russia today. But a less clear balance of power is emerging now, so I think that's what makes the current situation more dangerous and getting more so than it was for a dozen plus years after the Cold War.
Putin's trying to win back what Gorbachev gave up.
Yeah, Putin said the dissolution of the Soviet Union was the greatest tragedy in history. And I would say the problem is not that Putin is an evil, self-conscious aggressor, although that's the way he looks from this end. is that he believes he's completely justified in restoring Russia's greatness and in restoring the wrongful separation of Ukraine and so on.
He grew up in Leningrad, and he's felt terrible about what happened.
But he also miscalculated,
Exactly.
I think. If he'd known on February 22nd, 2022, that he was going to get into a 3-year-long war instead of just taking over Ukraine the way Bush thought we would take over Iraq in 2003, he probably wouldn't have done it. But in Asia, this is where the question is the biggest now, because Chinese power is roughly rivaling American, and nobody's sure sort of how much either is a little ahead of the other, and that's a situation ripe for miscalculation.
And they're going to go for Taiwan at some point.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, on that cheery note,
We never promised you a rose garden.
I was waiting to do that experiment to see if Daddy's right about us being more peaceful than mice. Throw a piece of cheese here in the middle of the table. But I wonder if anyone from the audience has a question they want to pose.
It seems there are different reasons for war. One is wanting the resources of the other people. But one that wasn't mentioned is religious wars. Yeah, it seems like humans are unique in going to war with someone just because of what the other side believes. Nothing material about it. I wonder if that's just an excuse, or there really is the religion. They go to war for other reasons, but they say it's for religion.
Great question. It's a wonderful question. We haven't talked much about racism, religious prejudice, or xenophobia, which are all
ideology.
which are all obviously related and related to your important question.
Well, I think part of the answer is that certain movements have a vision of the way society should be organized that they believe is absolute, the only moral course, the way God wants things. And they're not very interested in the idea that other people think differently and they have to find some compromise, which is an idea, the latter idea, I think, that's more common, rooted in the American political tradition, although it's faltered recently. I mean, the idea that there's one religion or one ideology that should be instituted in the United States and never challenged is alien to most people, but in a lot of other societies it seems natural. And once you believe that God wants things this way, how can you argue against it?
The professor put it this way at one point. He said, do we bring along with us? And so on. And we surely do. And I would use the word natural rather than just primitive. We bring along evolution with us. There's no escaping it because we are part and parcel of nature. And I would very much disagree that the human animal is any different at bottom from any other creature. My go-to is Stanley Kubrick's brilliant opening of 2001: Space Odyssey. I don't know whether you remember it. It's not about space. It's called The Dawn of Man, if you remember. And it's the fight over the waterhole between the two groups of monkey men, the human evolving from. I think he got it, and that's the way it is.
Yeah.
And we can try our best, and we should try our best. That's what civilization's about.
A fun fact
To
about
control, and so on. But we can't, and we won't, because we're part of Mother Nature. And Mother Nature has decreed for reasons we don't know that we are the way we are. That's mine.
Mark, you had a response?
Yeah, I think the 2001 and beginning is fun to watch. I mentioned to my students, and they have never seen the things they're really old. But relevant to this discussion, right, where that scene came from is Stanley Kubrick, right, that was getting it from Robert Ardrey. Robert Ardrey was a playwright in, like, I think the 1940s, 50s, 60s, lost his job, and then went to become a journalist and hung out with an anthropologist in South Africa who was studying some of the early humans, Australopithecines, like these bipedal apes. And this guy, Raymond Dart, who Robert Ardrey was hanging out with, Raymond Dart had this hypothesis. He said that humans are born in violence, we are innately violent, innately aggressive, and what made us human is our propensity to violence. And his argument was, well, look at all of these bones I'm finding at these sites of these Australopithecines, these sort of bipedal apes that are closer to humans than anything else. They're violent. We see the bones are broken, they're twisted in half. So he argued that Australopithecines were killing other Australopithecines, and that violence is what sort of drove humans to sort of be successful. We now know that the Australopithecines were not killing each other. They were being killed by the leopards and the hyenas, and their bones are breaking because of that. So I just think it's really interesting how that sort of narrative became so popular that, Robert Ardrey sort of argued, based on this data set, that we should see humans as innately violent because that's what who he was hanging out with at the time.
Can I just jump in for a second? Again, I want to kind of provide a little bit sort of hope for humans, because I think, as some fun facts, so the hypothalamus, which is the critical region, so for driving all these innate behaviors, including aggression, in mice, it's about 20% of the brain mass. And in humans, it's a 0.4%. So we have developed massive additional structures to control that. And interestingly, so the hypothalamus, which is the region we think those behaviors are kind of the aggressive motivation we consider, that's where it resides. And it needs to drive another structures called the midbrains to get it executed. So for the humans, in fact, there is a lot of direct projections from the prefrontal cortex just to the midbrains. So interestingly, prefrontal cortex doesn't go to the hypothalamus, doesn't go to those motive space that much, but it goes to the motor output. So basically, there is a way that you can feel this urge, but you don't execute it. That's, I think, how in humans you can actually stop it, much better controlled than in the rodents. So in that sense, yes, I think we all have this structures and the cells that drive us to respond to certain cues and express those behaviors. But in the humans, there is actually a lot more cognitive controls for the final expression. So we may still feel the urge, but we don't have to act on it because of those controls.
I wasn't going to say anything, but and was going to fight my impulse to make this comment, but I'm going to make it now anyway. Namely, but isn't it possible that we've adapted to the point where we can now get packed so much closer together? That trend which is towards eusociality means the humans can get packed closer together and live in close, very tight communities like we do here in New York. And then eventually we reach our limit and violence breaks out again. Is that a possible scenario?
Well, yes, and the only other thing that I would say, it is an enormous evolutionary accomplishment to have all of these complex prefrontal cortical regulatory mechanisms which directly or indirectly control amygdala activity, hippocampal activity, hypothalamic activity, thalamic activity, and so on. However, the one thing to be careful about is the ability of prefrontal cortical circuitry to manage aggressive impulsive behavior can quickly be taken offline under certain emotional circumstances, such as in war and with these atrocities I saw, in which people who ordinarily would have had very excellent inhibitory control over, I will call them primitive, let's call them basic sexual and aggressive impulses, for a time being in this state they were in of upset because of the death of their friends in combat, virtually lost all executive control of those impulses.
So I was wondering if, because we didn't seem to get much answer about what could be a pro-peace action, I was wondering if the committed and equitable sharing of resources among nations might be something like that. And then I was also curious about, we talked about mutual assured destruction. What about some of these conflicts that have sort of been nibbling around the edge of that, like Ukraine currently, or even Vietnam, where you had the two sides in sort of proxy fight? Well, I mean, Russia doesn't have a proxy for Russia in aggressive in the Ukraine. So what are your thoughts on both of those ideas?
Your area, no.
Go ahead, John.
Many ideologies and political movements have promoted the redistribution of resources more equitably throughout the world. But that means you have to take them away from some people and give them to other people. And the people you take them away from very often don't agree. So I think it's pretty hard to get around that basic problem that most of us are very humane in some ways, but very selfish about others. So I personally wouldn't hold out much hope for a sort of global socialism that would solve the problem. That doesn't mean there aren't other mechanisms or institutions that could be promoted that help. Personally, I don't think the United Nations amounts to much in producing peace, but it doesn't hurt for the most part. It helps. It helps around the edges. Peacekeeping missions and things like that are useful, and there are other things of that sort that can improve the situation. So, related to the point you were making earlier, there are things that can be done, but the barriers to seeing them as a general solution or a permanent solution are very high. They have been historically, and for good reason.
It seems the conditions for a general peace or a general cohesive agreement to work together rather than fight with each other occur perhaps under two circumstances for humans broadly. One is under great mutually agreed upon threat, the Mexico-America situation, larger through the nuclear threat. We might agree to give up warfare because we realize that we will all die in warfare. That is a possibility. The other would be that there's an alien invasion.
Right.
In which case, for the first time, we're all on the same team. And it's Team Earth against Team Galaxy X.
Except for the ones who would sell out to the aliens.
Yeah, they'll be the collaborators, of course. But that's how tribal battles go, right? I mean, xenophobia, the way to overcome xenophobia is for everyone to have a common enemy, unfortunately, rather than everyone to love each other, which would be preferable.
The Kansas City Chiefs, maybe.
Yeah.
But then once,
go ahead.
But then once you defeat the common enemy, the problem comes back.
Yeah.
The United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union were allies from 1941 to 45. But it only took a couple of years after Berlin fell for that to fall apart.
I was going to say, I confessed to asking the question about other things that might protect us from fighting other than threats of fighting. And I thought, well, people might mention religion. And it did come up ultimately, but I think not in the, right, everyone shakes their head. I think there was a time in which, just like we used to think our warriors were heroes, people thought religion was a movement towards peace, and now we think it causes wars as often as it quells them. I think what Richard was talking about earlier about religious tolerance, which is part of our original ideals of our country, I think do make a difference, and promoting that in some way. And then that falls under the umbrella of just education and maybe weak tea, but I think religious tolerance is an important thing, and maybe the UN, what it might do is at least stand in for that ideal of tolerance, right, which is important to promote.
My question was about de-escalation of conflicts, but and also the use of AI I know it's being used widely in designing weapons, but I'm wondering if you are aware of any cases in which it's being used to de-escalate conflicts. And also, lastly, Trump is talking to Putin, and I know people were upset that Elon Musk talked to Putin supposedly. Can you imagine a conversation in which Putin would agree to de-escalate his war with the Ukraine?
Great question.
He gets an estate in Monaco that's protected, and he gets all the money in the world, and maybe he'll de-escalate. I don't know. He's got so much on the line in terms of his own country, and he feels so strongly about, as I understand it from what I read, about the fact that he's trying to put together what was once the great Soviet Union, and he's got so many people behind him on that. The only thing that could take him off the rails is if he does run out of money, and right now he's got alliances. He's been able to maneuver North Korea, getting some help in other places. So I don't know. I assume there's going to be some compromise at some point to bring the Ukrainian war to the end, and I assume it'll be around everybody benefiting somehow in an unstated way. And the people not benefiting will be the Ukrainians, because they'll end up with a widely damaged country, and Putin will simply go on, is what I think will happen ultimately. But I don't know. I'm not an expert.
Thank you. Any others?
It's a great question. It's a wonderful question. I don't know. Trump's engagement with quote-unquote dictators is one of the great, interesting, enigmatic things of modern history. And on the surface of it, people have often a very reflexive negative reaction to it, that he identifies as a kind of dictator-like figure himself, and but it's probably much more complicated than that, and it's pretty clear that the liberal democratic response has been ineffective. Mm-hmm. The question will then become, can a response from Trump's team be more effective? I think we at least should be open to the possibility. I agree with you on that point.
Thank you.
Well, after that question, mine was to address a very tiny piece of civilization. In the answer to the question about development and how boys and men develop their testosterone and their fighting ability, it's classic understanding, at least in the Western civilization, that boys need rough and tumble play, which they engage 3 years old. As soon as a little boy is able to run around and grab daddy and try to control him, daddy engages in rough and tumble play, in which the daddy always is bigger, stronger, and therefore has to learn to modify his aggression in order for the boy to develop neurotypically, according to our understanding of development. Pediatricians know this, psychiatrists, psychoanalysts know this. The rough and tumble play is essential for the boy to learn how to deal with his proprioceptive ability, his strength, his father's strength. And they could do rough and tumble play up to the point where dad can't just easily cave in, and the boy knows he could really overpower his father, and then they have a sort of psychological duel, and then they stop doing the rough and tumble play, and the boy moves on to the playground, where it's more dangerous. But he still has learned through this rough and tumble play how to manage his own skills, how to know whether he's assertive enough, aggressive enough, and what's more like Mexico and the United States. So it applies in a greater sense, more abstractly, to a Mexico-United States version of civilization. But and my other question is in terms of mice. It's fascinating that mice will continue and learn from killing that they should do more killing, and there's no consequence to to that, whereas the rough and tumble play of mankind, literally men, women have a different system. Oxytocin prevents them from engaging in it. But what does it mean that mice do what they do? They keep killing, and yet humans are civilized according to our developmental theories because men have had rough and tumble play and have learned how to manage their bodies and the aggression.
Thank you.
So I couldn't hear the question fully, but I think a part of it is about the development of aggression as well as the mice they're killing and getting reward without punishment. So one thing I do want to clarify is that it's not killing; it is winning. Okay, and in the wild, often that does not involve in killing because the loser would just run away. So in a confined situation, which in the lab we do not let it happen, but in a confined situation, that in order to take the entire territory, they could killing. Usually that happens accidentally when the mice being grouped together, but was not intentionally. They were supposed to be cage mates. At some points, they might become aggressive. But in the normal conditions, they will just have a winner, have a loser, and the loser will run away. So it will not involving death of a conspecific. And in most of the wild animal conflicts, that's how it ends. Basically, the loser retreat. So on that, and the development of aggression, in the mice, actually, they don't do much of a play fighting, but the rats do that. Just like humans, like in the adolescence period of time, they will have sort of fighting, but it's more of a not causing any injury, but more kind of a practice that skill each thing. For the mice, they don't do that, but interestingly, there is a learning curve for the mice as an adult. For most of the mice, that their aggression will increase as they kind of get exposed, do this practice more. So initially they will be kind of clumsy and not very effective. But then as they engage in those actions more, then they refine their motor skills and become more efficient in doing those. So there is some sort of, even though we consider it's an innate behaviors, the circuit is all wired up, but the circuit is not very efficient at the beginning. So it requires some of sort of learning curve, which is not being taught. It's kind of a self-learning curve, but for the aggression to become matured in a sense.
I think we have time for one more question.
I don't remember who brought up Steven Pinker, but Better Angels for Nature is a very interesting book. And you could question the whole premise that the world's becoming less violent, which is his basic premise. And, you know, it's not a priori that seems completely wrong, but if you read the book, it's somewhat convincing. But the reason I bring it up is because of the reasons he gives why the world is, in his view, becoming less violent. And there are basically three reasons. One is the increasing organization of society, the larger and larger political groupings, which you could see, I mean, I think to a certain extent that's inevitable because of technological progress, because there are things that can't be done on a small scale that we all want to do. So that's number one, so you don't have all these small groups fighting with each other. The second one is not religious toleration, but the growth of secularism, the death of religious belief. And the third is the liberation of women. Okay, something that none of our male panelists mentioned. But women are different from men. And
that's okay.
Well, we have yet to see evidence that women in charge of governments under the pressures of political conflict will necessarily produce policies different from men.
Well, not individual women, not the women who rise to be prime minister. We haven't tried the experiment where the government consists completely. I I mean, anybody who rises to be prime minister is an unusual person with a lot of aggression and power.
Yeah, well, that may be too, but the possibility is also that women in power, even if they are different from men, face circumstances that historically have pushed nations into the use of force.
It's possible until we do the experiment.
I endorse that thesis, especially if I want to go home and enjoy my evening tonight.
Can I say a quick thing about the aggression? Sorry, it just occurs to me, hasn't mentioned the sexual dimorphism of aggression, which is actually, at the neurocircuit levels, it is actually very dimorphic. And in the areas in charge of aggression, most critical for aggression, in the females, they're about 50% less cells, fewer cells in comparison to the males. In mice, in mice. I have no idea how it goes in humans or the species, but in mice, male mice, that area is about twice as big. And in terms of also, I mentioned the dopamine release during aggression. In mice, again, that actually only applies to the males. So in the females, there's no dopamine release. So during the maternal aggression, females in mice only show aggression during maternal period in protecting the young, and there is no dopamine release, and that behavior cannot be reinforced. So it is very much just the changes with their lactation period based on the needs of the young, but they will not become more and more aggressive just because they win. So there are some very clear differences between male and female aggression behaviors, and that's indeed, there is a biological explanation to it at the neurocircuit level. Yeah.
It's also really interesting because you brought this up, that sexual dimorphism really reduces over human evolutionary time. Like in the Australopithecines, the males and females are pretty different. It's kind of easy to recognize. For modern humans, it's actually really hard, contemporary humans, Homo sapiens, to know is the skull you look at male or female unless you have a really good sample set, or unless you're a forensic anthropologist studying a well-known condition. So I think it's really the idea that over time we become less dimorphic and maybe more peaceable is actually, I think, a really good hypothesis.
It's possible. I mean, the sexual dimorphism, again, aggression is a behavior that under reproduction selection pressure. So the difference in aggression level between male and females generally differs also based on the size difference. For species that male has much bigger size than the females, which in the mice is the case, then the aggression level tend to be high. There are species, the female is bigger than the male, and they are actually more aggressive than the males. So it's all, evolutionary selection pressures, whether the males are in the seat to compete for the mating opportunities, and if so, there will be more size difference, and there's more difference in their aggression levels. And in fact, I think they are. I read an interesting paper saying that monogamous species tend to be like the male-female size tend to be more similar, and in those cases, the aggression level tend to be more similar. The male-female will both take on the intruders and will defend the home. But in the in the species that has a lot of female, you know what I mean? Yeah, so then the size difference will be much bigger, and then the males will be a lot more aggressive than the females. So, where human lies in that spectrum, we can argue about it.
Okay.
So, well, I'm pleased to say that to put an end to this conversation, I'm going to have to threaten someone to a fight. This has been really very stimulating and really interesting. I want to thank everyone on the panel, including our remote participants, and look forward to seeing you next time.
Oh, yeah.
She's great. She's great.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you.
Hi, thank you.
Yeah, she's one of my faculty that may win a Nobel Prize.
About 40 numbers. I don't hate 40 numbers, but I hate all football.
You hate all football? So which sport do you love?
But I have been
passive aggression.
But which sport do you love then? Which sports do you love? Oh, then you're not tribal.
That's why we're passive.
Yeah, you should get involved with football immediately. It will,
Enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Enjoyed it a lot.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah,
I just mean.
yeah. Mother Nature. There be any question? It's so freaking obvious. I mean, the longer you live, the more you know. Why is creation the way it is? That we don't know. We can't know. Right. Of course. Right.
So what gets you there?
And we
I love this comment. Let's see what they say about
well, that was a good one.
it. That was right.